The Industrial City, a Mixed Vision. The Gilded Age was a time of tremendous growth in this country, and nowhere is that more evident than in the growth of the cities, a process known as urbanization. As just one example, the city of Chicago in 1830 had only 230 people. By 1860, it had more than 100,000 people, and by 1890, more than 1 million. Businesses flourished during this period, as we discussed in the previous chapter. Factories and industry sprang up in many of the large cities, and the cities grew in leaps and bounds. Immigrants poured into the country to do this labor that was so necessary, and that growth was apparent in the big cities. If you notice the figures on the screen in front of you, there are just a few examples of this growth. New York City multiplies between 1870 and 1900 almost 4 times over, from 942,000 to 3.4 million. Chicago, which I just mentioned and which will come up several times as in some ways the quintessential Gilded Age city, multiplies about 6 times over, from 298,000 to 1.7 million. Even some of the older traditional cities like Philadelphia nearly doubled in population, from 674,000 to 1 million. The nation's capital, Washington, D.C., almost tripled in size, from 109,000 to 278,000. And the classic New South city of Atlanta multiplied almost 5 times over, from 21,000 to 90,000. And yet what we see in these cities is something of a mixed vision. Yes, in the cities you see signs of growth and progress, tremendous innovation and industry. It's a time of great change. Transportation is evolving. Mechanization is evolving. The streets are getting more congested. The buildings are getting taller. And so we see mixed impressions of the cities during this period. Let me share with you just 2 impressions of the city of Chicago. Here is Rudyard Kipling writing in 1899. It is inhabited by savages. Its air is dirt. I looked down interminable vistas flanked with 9, 10, and 15-storied houses, and crowded with men and women, and the show impressed me with a great horror. So, Kipling obviously is not terribly impressed by the city of Chicago. And yet here is a countervision from the poet Carl Sandburg, who wrote about his city, Chicago, in 1916. I turn once more to those who sneer at this my city, and I give them back the sneer, and say to them, come and show me another city with lifted head, singing so proud to be alive and coarse and strong and cunning. Under the smoke, dust all over his mouth, laughing with white teeth, bragging and laughing, that under his wrist is the pulse, and under his ribs the heart of the people. Laughing, laughing the stormy, husky, brawling laughter of youth, half-naked, sweating, proud to be the hog butcher, tool maker, stacker of wheat, player with railroads, and freight handler to the nation. So Sandburg, too, sees the dirt and the muck and the mire, but in this he sees essentially the lifeblood of the country, the pulse, and everything that this nation has to be proud of. Before we move on to a discussion of some of the details involved in this process of urbanization, let's look at a few images and get a sense of what the cities looked like and what Americans might have experienced during that time. What you see on the screen now is a picture of the city of Milwaukee around the turn of the century, 1890s, 1900. As you look at the picture, you might drink in some of the different elements of the image itself. Some of the things that strike me in this picture, well, first of all, it's sort of gray and dingy. It is a black and white photograph, but you get a sense that there was a lot of smoke and smog and pollution. You see the elevated train rumbling through in the foreground. And one of the things that might strike you is just the density of the city itself. Building upon building upon building, very little open space. And something else that you might notice, if you look in the foreground at the bottom, there is a bit of open space there, but what you'll notice is we are not yet to the age of the automobile. All of the vehicles you see there are horse-drawn. This is something we'll be talking about shortly. This period really is the intersection of a lot of different kinds of transportation coming together. But for the moment, in this picture, you see horse-drawn trolleys or carriages along with the elevated train rumbling above. This is a famous picture of one of the immigrant neighborhoods during this era. Again, lots of different things going on in this picture, but first and foremost, I think you notice that life just kind of overflows out into the streets, and you have lots of little salesmen and different opportunities to engage in business out in the streets. And that is one of the things that, again, we will talk about during this period. As the cities grow, open spaces and open areas are paved under, to the point that in many cases there really was nowhere else to go to engage in your business and do other things except right out in the streets. And we'll see that reflected in a few of the other pictures as well. The cities are growing upwards as well. During this period, we have filled in much of the space. There isn't as much space for things like urban sprawl, and so we begin to see the buildings getting taller and taller, which leads us to this rather imposing and intimidating picture you see here. I'm not really sure what this gentleman is doing other than posing or perhaps clowning around a bit at work for this picture being taken. But I think it does reflect in some ways the hazards of the occupations we discussed in the previous chapter. And one thing you might notice if you look at this gentleman closely is that he's only hanging on with one arm. His right arm, which are on our left, is not looped around that chain, nor is his foot firmly in that hook. So this looks to be a terribly dangerous pose that he's striking. This is a picture of an immigrant classroom. Again, there are a number of different things you might notice in this picture. For one thing, of course, it appears to be a very crowded classroom. We think about issues involving class size and education today, but those issues are not new for us in our era. The other thing, and of course what your attention is drawn to in the picture, is the American flag in the front and all the children saluting, perhaps saying the Pledge of Allegiance. If you were to see a caption for this picture, it always notes something to that effect. And this is the process of Americanization, teaching immigrant children about the flag, about our country, about what is involved in being a good citizen in a democracy, and so on. But I'm always drawn as well to the window in the background of the picture. And if you look out the window, you see that these children had a nice view of the building right next door, just a few inches away, it seems. And again, that's indicative of the growth of the cities, the crowded nature of the cities, and how the buildings just piled on top of one another in this era. And this is one of the most famous pictures of this era. It is in almost every textbook I've seen from this period. The intersection of Dearborn and Randolph Streets in Chicago. This is from the year 1890. and it encapsulates in one picture almost everything that we're going to be talking about in terms of the different qualities of urbanization. But of course, for one thing, you notice the sheer congestion, the mass and population, everything just piling up on this one street corner. Again, as we saw in an earlier picture, you notice the different kinds of transportation, but looking closely once again, you might realize that this is before the automobile itself, although it might not look like it on first glance, but all of the automobiles here are horse-drawn, so we are prior to the car as we know it. And yet you also have the electric trolleys, and quite a few of them, jamming up this very busy intersection. And here is another image depicting that process of life just kind of flowing out into the streets. You get yet another way of thinking about the prominence of horse-drawn transportation during this time. But of course, I think the most obvious feature of this picture is the incredible prominence of filth and muck lying in the middle of the street. And we can speculate as far as what that various piles of muck and filth consists of. It's a black and white photograph. It may involve perhaps some snow. It's not clear whether this might have been snow piling up in the streets. But you also see some overturned baskets, so there's probably a certain amount of garbage and just debris. But one other thing that doesn't always come to mind when we think about this era, with the prominence of horses, was the overwhelming presence of waste. And you've all experienced what horses do if there's a parade and horses are walking down the streets and the result lands in the middle of the street. And we get a sense of that from this picture. And if you read accounts of this era, when you're talking about thousands and thousands of horses in all the major cities, the streets piling up and filling up with that waste. And essentially you had to wait for a good rain shower to wash away much of that filth. And so in this case, we see much of it just piling up in the middle of the street. And here's a final photograph bringing again some of these themes into one image, a little bit grainier photograph. But you get, again, a sense of life happening in the streets. You have a group of children here, probably with nowhere else to play. They just move out into the street. But of course, the obvious image in this photograph is the dead horse lying just a couple of feet away from those children playing in the street. Today, of course, we would understand the health concerns related to that. Can only imagine what it might have smelled like to be so close to that dead animal. But it also brings to mind the thought that someone is going to have to come and take care of that issue. And this was a real problem in the cities of that era, keeping up with so many horses, other animals, and transportation was not what it is now. So cleaning up all of these kinds of messes would have involved considerable effort. And as a final note, we look at the children here playing, dipping their toes ever so gently into that little sewer running along the side of the street. And again, we can imagine the nature of the water in that little ditch. We will be talking during this lecture about health issues and mortality rates, and while we sympathize with these children who need to play and seem to be having a good enough time out here in the streets, we can also imagine the prominence of disease and illness and perhaps premature death for some of these very kids.